Let's start with the version of this argument you've probably already heard. Kenny is exhausting. He explodes at the wrong moments. He lectures people who are already suffering. And by season 3, a lot of viewers had simply stopped rooting for him and started dreading his scenes. That reaction shows up constantly in fan discussions, and it's not an unreasonable one. He is, by a wide margin, one of the most emotionally volatile characters in From. Here's the part most of those takes miss. Volatility is not the same thing as failure, and if you actually track what happens to Kenny across 4 seasons, instead of judging him scene by scene, a different pattern shows up. The town of Fromville runs on a very specific weapon. It finds out who you love, threatens that person, and waits for grief to make you controllable. It has used that weapon on nearly everyone in this show, and on Kenny, of all people, the person who's lost more than almost anyone else. It keeps landing the hit and missing the follow-through. That's the theory we're testing today. Not that Kenny is secretly magic, not that he's been chosen by anything, just that the town's own strategy, when pointed at this specific person, appears to be quietly failing. And Season 4 just gave us the clearest evidence yet, because the show finally revealed exactly who's been running the manipulation the whole time and where it decided to aim next. Stick around, because by the end of this, we're also going to build a genuinely testable prediction for what a final season bargain aimed at Kenny would actually have to look like, based on everything the show has already shown its hand on. Quick context for anyone who needs it. Kenny Liu wasn't born Kenny. His birth name is Fu-Hen Liu, son of Chinese immigrants Bing Chen and Tian Chen, who settled in Texas before an ordinary drive turned into a one-way trip into Fromville. Before he was a deputy, before he carried a badge, he was a caretaker. His father was fighting dementia. His mother ran the diner that fed half the town. Kenny's entire identity was already built around being useful to people who depended on him, long before the town ever got involved. That matters because it tells you what kind of person the town was actually dealing with. This wasn't someone chasing power or control for its own sake. This was someone who had organized his whole life around the idea that if he stayed responsible enough, careful enough, present enough, the people he loved would be safe. Boyd noticed that reliability early and handed him a badge for it. And for a while, that belief held up. Everyone had a role. Everyone followed the rules. The system worked, right up until it didn't. His father's death is where the town lands its first real hit, and it doesn't come from a monster grabbing someone off the street. It comes from a decision Sarah makes while she's being manipulated, opening a door that should have stayed shut. Kenny is away, doing something useful, and comes back to find that his usefulness didn't protect anyone. Then it gets worse, because Boyd already knows the truth and sits on it. He decides that protecting Sarah and whatever value she might offer the group later matters more than giving Kenny an honest answer about how his father actually died. When Kenny finds out, he doesn't just get angry at the town. He throws his badge at the man who gave it to him and walks away. And that scene tells you something important. Kenny's loyalty was never really about the badge or the title. It was conditional on trust. And once Boyd broke that trust for what he believed was a good enough reason, Kenny made it clear the position itself held no automatic authority over him. What's more interesting is what happens after. Kenny doesn't stay gone. He comes back and picks the job up again, but on different terms. Not because he's forgiven Boyd, and not because he's rebuilt blind faith in him. He comes back because the town still needs the work done, and he's decided he can separate the person from the job. That's a small shift, but it's the first sign that whatever the town is trying to do to him isn't landing the way it's supposed to. His mother's death is worse, and not just because it's a second loss stacked on the first. Tian Chen wasn't only Kenny's remaining parent. She ran the one place in Fromville where people from different corners of the town actually crossed paths during daylight. She fed people who had nothing. In a town designed to isolate everyone from each other, the diner was one of the last things holding a fragile sense of community together. And Kenny inherited that instinct from her. Her death isn't a random encounter either. It happens while Boyd is trapped and forced to watch, and Kenny is once again out searching for food for the town, doing the responsible thing, and coming home to discover it bought him nothing. This is the moment the theory could have simply ended, because right after, Kenny does exactly what the town seems to want. He destroys a jukebox that starts playing music at the worst possible moment, gathers alcohol, and heads for the tunnels planning to burn the creatures while they sleep. Boyd doesn't stop him. Boyd goes with him. For a few minutes, the show lets you believe this is it. This is the moment Kenny becomes exactly what grief is supposed to turn a person into. Then Boyd tells him his mother's actual last words, and Kenny stops. He doesn't forgive anything. He doesn't abandon the idea of fighting back eventually. He just refuses to let the first decision he makes after losing his mother be the one most likely to get him and Boyd killed. That's not the town winning. That's Kenny choosing to grieve instead of detonate, which is a much harder thing to do and a much less useful outcome for whatever is running this town. Here's the mechanism worth naming directly. The town's strategy assumes attachment works one way. You love someone, the town threatens or removes them, and grief either breaks you or makes you easy to steer. That pattern goes all the way back to how this town apparently got started in the first place, with parents trading their own children away for something framed as eternal life. Attachment, in that origin story, curdled into ownership. Love became a price people were willing to make someone else pay. Kenny is the clearest counterexample the show has produced. He's lost both parents and hasn't demanded anyone else pay for that loss. He hasn't taken a shortcut that requires sacrificing another resident. And critically, his sense of purpose didn't disappear when the people who originally gave it to him did. His father taught him patience. His mother taught him that survival is also about food and routine and showing up for people. Boyd, even through betrayal, taught him what leadership looks like and where it breaks down. None of those lessons required the teacher to still be alive. What that means practically is that Kenny's loyalty stopped being concentrated in one relationship the town could threaten and started being spread across an entire community. You can still hurt him by hurting someone he cares about. That hasn't changed. But removing any single person doesn't erase his reason to keep showing up, because that reason no longer lives in one place. Now let's actually deal with the criticism instead of talking around it, because it deserves a real answer. If Kenny's arc is this coherent, why do so many viewers find him nearly unbearable to watch by season 3? The honest answer is that consistency and likability are not the same thing, and From isn't really interested in making this easy on you. Kenny's coping mechanism is control. When his environment is stable, that shows up as responsibility, patience, and being the guy who quietly holds things together. When his environment collapses, that exact same trait shows up as rigid self-righteousness, snapping at people who are already struggling and picking fights that don't need to happen. It's the same wiring producing very different results depending on how much pressure it's under. That's a defensible creative choice. A character whose strength and his most grating flaw come from the identical source. But it's also a completely fair reason to find him hard to sit through in the moment. Realistic doesn't automatically mean enjoyable to watch, and both of those things can be true about the same performance. Where this stops being just a character flaw and starts being relevant to the actual theory is that this volatility is precisely why the town should have an easier time using him than it does. A person running that hot should be simple to provoke into a mistake that costs him everything. Instead, every time the show pushes him to that edge, something pulls him back before it becomes permanent. There are two other fan theories worth putting under real scrutiny here, because they're both trying to explain the exact same observation we've been building toward. They just reach for a supernatural explanation instead of a psychological one. The first says Kenny's birth name, Fu-Hen, is the key. The idea is that the creatures haven't used it against him the way the show has established them using other people's names to unsettle and manipulate. And that gap might function as a kind of built-in protection tied to him going by an adopted name instead of the one he was born with. It's a genuinely fun read, and it fits the show's broader interest in identity and what people leave behind when they reinvent themselves to survive somewhere new. But it's worth being honest about what this is right now, a pattern some viewers have noticed, not something the show has confirmed. We haven't been shown every character's full name-calling history, which makes it hard to prove this is unique to Kenny rather than something we simply haven't seen on screen. The second theory is broader. It points out that Kenny has been through arguably the worst run of losses of anyone still alive in this town, And yet he's stayed more level-headed and consistent than characters who've suffered far less, and treats that gap as evidence that something supernatural might be protecting him or marking him as important to whatever the show is building toward. Here's the problem with both of those readings, and it's not that they're unreasonable, it's that they reach for magic before ruling out psychology. You don't need a hidden protective force to explain why someone raised by a caretaking mother and a father who taught him patience through illness would default to steady, practical behavior under pressure instead of collapsing. That's not a supernatural exemption. That's what happens when a person's coping mechanisms were built years before the town ever trapped him. The more interesting version of this theory doesn't need Kenny to be chosen by anything. It just needs him to be consistent, and the show has done a lot of quiet work explaining why he would be. Here's where this stops being purely theoretical, because Season 4 gave us something the earlier seasons didn't. A direct look at who's actually been orchestrating all of this. Early in the season, the show reveals that a new arrival named Sophia, who shows up as a stranded pastor's daughter after a car crash, is the man in yellow wearing a disguise. This is the entity that's been pulling strings since Season 1, and for the first time, it's not lurking in the woods. It's living inside the community, indistinguishable from anyone else. And look at who it chooses to get close to first. Sophia doesn't attach herself to Boyd, who's exhausted and skeptical enough to be a harder target. She doesn't go after Tabitha, who already carries a different kind of trauma the entity could exploit. She goes to Kenny. She uses shared faith and grief to build trust with him specifically, leaning on the fact that he's already primed to respond to that kind of language after everything he's lost. Every warm moment between them in those early episodes is manufactured, calculated, and aimed directly at the one relationship dynamic most likely to lower his guard. That's not a coincidence, and it tells you something the earlier seasons only implied. The entity behind this town has clearly identified Kenny as a priority target. It's not ignoring him. If anything, Season 4 suggests it's been paying closer attention to him than almost anyone else, which only makes it more significant that the approach still doesn't fully land. Kenny stays wary of Sophia even while comforting her, questions her choices even while helping her, and never actually hands her the kind of complete trust that would make the whole infiltration worth it. Then comes the moment that most directly tests everything we've been talking about. Later in the season, Boyd is in no condition to lead an attack against the creatures himself, so Kenny volunteers to take his place, armed with a new weapon built from totems that are supposed to work where old methods failed. It doesn't go the way anyone hopes. The weapon fails against a fully awake creature, and Kenny ends up trapped, chased onto the roof of a bus by the most dangerous entity in the show, surviving only because another character's unexpected connection to that creature buys him just enough time to escape. Strip away the horror show mechanics and look at what that scene is actually doing structurally. The most dangerous creature in Fromville gets Kenny cornered, and instead of simply attacking, it goes out of its way to remind him of exactly how his father died. That's not necessary for a kill. That's psychological. The show is explicitly telling you the creatures still believe Kenny's grief is the most reliable way into him. And once again, it doesn't work as intended. He's rattled. He's not tactically perfect in that moment, but he doesn't freeze, doesn't bargain, and makes it out. By the end of the season, most recaps agree Kenny's own arc lands as one of the quieter ones compared to what happens around him. Compare that to the two people closest to him in that final stretch. One character, Elgin, is offered a version of exactly the deal we've been discussing all video. A way to make things easier if he cooperates with the entity, and he refuses. He still ends up dead anyway, which is its own uncomfortable wrinkle we'll get to in a second. Another character, Fatima, ends the season fundamentally changed after her bond with the resurrected creature Smiley costs her something the show frames as her own humanity. The town found real leverage in her in a way it hasn't managed with Kenny. Put those two outcomes side by side and the contrast is the whole argument in miniature. The entity clearly knows how to exploit love, sacrifice, and desperation when the right person is in front of it. It's done it to Sarah. It's arguably doing it to Fatima by the finale. It just keeps failing to fully close the loop on Kenny specifically, and Season 4 suggests that's not for lack of trying. That Elgin situation deserves its own moment, because it complicates the theory in a useful way instead of just supporting it. If refusing the entity's bargain were enough to guarantee survival, Elgin's storyline would have ended differently. He says no to Sophia. He does what looks, by the show's own moral logic, like the right thing. And it doesn't save him. That matters for how we should think about what's coming for Kenny. This isn't a show where making the noble choice automatically protects you. And it would be a mistake to assume Kenny is safe simply because he keeps passing the town's tests. What Elgin's arc actually demonstrates is that refusing the bargain and surviving the bargain are two separate outcomes, and From has shown it's willing to separate them. Kenny's pattern of resisting manipulation tells us something real about his psychology holding up. It doesn't tell us the show is guaranteeing him a happy ending. While we're grading theories against what actually happened, it's worth checking two other predictions that have been circulating for a while, because they hold up differently. The first is the idea that Kenny's story only works as a cycle of repeated punishment, that every season the show needs to find a fresh way to hurt him just to keep his arc moving. There's real evidence for that reading. Something significant happens to Kenny in every single season so far, and season 4, with Sophia's manipulation and the rooftop chase, keeps that streak intact. But notice that this reading and the one we've been building all video aren't actually opposites. A character can be the show's most reliable source of suffering and also be the character that suffering keeps failing to fully control. Those two things aren't in conflict. They might be the same observation viewed from two different angles. The second prediction is more specific, and it hasn't paid off yet. A chunk of the fandom has expected Christy to be the next loss, on the theory that removing the one relationship that still points toward a future for Kenny would finally be the breaking point the town needs. Through the end of season 4, she's still alive, still very much present in his life, and still one of the people he trusts most. That doesn't mean the theory is dead. If anything, given everything we've laid out about how the entity operates, Christy is exactly the kind of remaining connection a final season would need to threaten. It just hasn't happened yet, which either means the show is saving it, or it means the writers decided that particular lever stopped being useful once Kenny's loyalty spread out the way it did. There's also a rumor that's circulated based on nothing more than the actor's own social media, suggesting Kenny might not survive the show's final stretch. That's worth mentioning honestly, mostly because it's unverifiable and easy to overread. Actors post cryptic things about characters they love all the time, and it rarely means what fans hope or fear it means. What we can say for certain is that Kenny made it through all 10 episodes of Season 4 in one piece, which at minimum tells us whatever the endgame is, it wasn't Season 4. From has already been confirmed for a 5th season, described by the people running the show as the final one, expected sometime in 2027. Whatever 4 years of broken chess games and burned trust have been building toward has to actually resolve. So let's turn everything Season 4 just handed us into a real, checkable prediction instead of a vague guess. Based on the pattern we've traced, a final attempt to break Kenny almost certainly can't rely on removing more people from his life. The show has tried that twice already, with his father and his mother, and both times it produced someone harder to control, not easier. It also probably can't rely purely on quiet infiltration the way Sophia's approach did, because Kenny's guard, while lowered, was never fully down. And he never handed her the kind of complete trust that would have made the long con worth it. The entity needs something bigger than either of those tools, and the show has spent this season quietly assembling the pieces for exactly that. Here's what we know it has to work with. Kenny has already watched a creature return from the dead, so resurrection is no longer a theoretical rule in this world. It's something he's personally witnessed. He's also watched Fatima's bond with that same creature curdle into something she never agreed to, which establishes that connection to these creatures can happen without full consent on the human side. Put those two facts together, and there's an uncomfortable, specific shape to what the final offer probably looks like. Not a threat. An offer dressed up as mercy that requires Kenny to treat someone else the exact way the original townspeople treated their own children, trading a life he didn't ask to trade in exchange for getting his family back. If the show stays consistent with everything it's built in Kenny so far, the most likely outcome is that he refuses. But Season 4 just taught us something uncomfortable through Elgin, which is that refusing the bargain and surviving the bargain are not the same guarantee. The real test in the final season probably isn't whether Kenny says yes or no. It's whether saying no is enough to save him, or whether From decides that this is finally the season where doing the right thing stops being sufficient protection. So back to where we started. Is Kenny exhausting to watch sometimes? Genuinely, yes, and that's a fair thing to feel about him. But exhausting and broken aren't the same thing, and the town of Fromville seems to be discovering that difference the hard way. It removed the two people Kenny was most afraid of losing, expecting collapse, and got a version of him that spread his loyalty out too wide to threaten with one hostage ever again. That's not a triumphant arc. It's a slow, occasionally infuriating one, but it might be the only kind of resistance this particular town has never fully figured out how to counter. If Season 5 follows the shape of everything we just walked through, the real final test isn't whether the monsters can hurt Kenny again. They clearly can, and probably will. It's whether they can ever get him to believe that hurting someone else is an acceptable price for getting his family back. 4 seasons in, the smart money says no. But From has spent its entire run proving that the smart money is usually missing something. What do you think the price of that final offer actually ends up being? Drop your prediction, and if you think this read on Kenny is wrong, tell me why.